Right. I'm recording here with Dan. How are you doing today, Dan?
Doing all right.
Very good.
Uh,
You have some articles. You're a writer, and you actually write about um, a lot of things that are interesting to me. So I took some notes on just an overview of centralization, demographics, Gen X, which I think is the generation that nobody talks about. In fact, I saw an article the other day where it was like, it was talking about intergenerational conflict, and it had three different pictures. It had Zoomers, Millennials, and Boomers, the conflict
hmm
between the generations. And I was like,
That's
isn't
pretty
that a
typical.
perfect representation? And I was thinking, is this author Gen X? Is this a Gen X person, writing this article? Um, it kind of reminds me a lot of times the way in America we think about the WASP, right? So
Mm.
so where WASP culture, Anglo culture, what is that? Where did it come from? Where did it go? It's almost like um, when we think about the different facets of American culture, so the holidays, Halloween, Christmas, and so on. It's like it's so we're like fish in water with it, and so you can't see it,
Yeah.
and so you ask somebody what's your culture, and they're like, well, I'm just an American, because they can't see their own ethnicity. And in the same way, I
Yeah.
feel that Gen X has this feeling that well, we don't really have a particular like Gen X thing. We're just normal. We're just normal humans, right?
Yeah.
We're just the default people.
There was a wonderful Clive Barker had a stage play called The History of the Devil, and there was this one exchange in there that's always stuck with me. Um, one of the uh, one of the female characters said, "I have no idea what it's like to be a woman, having never been a man." Um, that idea that you have to experience the contrast to really understand what it is that you're doing has always stuck with me as being really interesting.
Yeah. Yeah, that is interesting. I mean, that statement itself, um, the ability to understand masculinity and femininity by embodying or participating in that dialectic. And if you stand outside it, if you're neutral, if you're androgynous, then it's not going to make sense to you because it's something that can only be understood experientially, through
Yeah,
direct engagement. And so that's kind of a paradox for a scientific culture because
true.
oftentimes we think that in order to increase our understanding, we have to become more aloof, more objective, more distant. And when we remove ourselves from the play, then we can fully understand what's going on here and there, and actually to have a bias to you just say, well, I come from a particular standpoint, is seen as corrosive. Even I think there's like a maybe a continental philosophy tradition that's more amenable to that. But I'm thinking of in critical theory, or standpoint theory, the idea that you have to examine your own kind of cultural bias, and it's almost always the word cultural bias. We have a bias against bias. Like we assume that it's bad to have a bias, but on the other hand, it's necessary to live. If you're completely objective and beside yourself, then you're not participating in life. You're not present. You're not engaged, and so you become passive and you become a voyeur, rather than an
Yeah.
active participant. And so it's interesting because the
And, and,
scientific
and
process
technically,
itself. Yeah, go ahead.
to use psychological language, what you're describing is a dissociative state. I've as much of an anti-Hegelian as I am, my solution to the, or my view of the whole situation is a little bit of a Hegelian synthesis. The Enlightenment ideal of the view from nowhere is incredibly important epistemically for understanding the natural world. That the human world is very much an embodied experiential one, and it's not, and the importance of it is less epistemic than it is relational. And the problem with critical theory I have is that it tries to import the relational into the epistemic, and the problem I have with Enlightenment rationalism is that it tries to substitute the epistemic for the relational.
Yeah, I was about to say that I think the will of science, the will to truth, the will to understand, is at its origin a very active, aggressive position toward nature, where you're experimenting, and you're kind of going outside the bounds necessarily in order to discover. You must violate certain boundaries. In order to discover America, you have to leave the boundaries of Europe. In order to discover some new chemical, you basically have to do something wrong. You have to start making mistakes.
Genuinely, in terms of ancient morality, you have to do something sinful. You have to do the ritually impure by crossing the boundary.
Right. Yeah. That it's true. I mean, this is corresponding to that masculine-feminine dynamic, is that in order for a ritual to be sacred, it must implicitly contain the concept of the taboo or the profane.
Yep.
Nothing can be sacred if there isn't in order to invent sacredness, you have to invent sin. And if you eliminate sin, then you've eliminated sacredness. And so with science is like trying to transgress boundaries, and one of the ways that you can achieve that more easily is to just abolish the moral weight of those boundaries and to say, well, gods, schmods, whatever. It's like, yeah, we have this mythology, but who really cares? Like, we can just step outside of that. And look, no one's going to strike me down with lightning. See, I'm fine. Everything's fine. And now we can just go about doing some science. So, I think that almost works as in a dialectic or a context where you have a culture that has a background noise of norms. And if you as an individual are able to say, well, I in particular don't need those norms, and so I can step outside of that and I can pursue something else. As you're talking about this relational quality, I'm thinking of that dynamic between the individual and the collective. And although the individual will say, I as an individual don't need these norms, in a sense, on a collective level, relationally, the individual, even the person who has no respect for religion, they need, and I think Ernst Junger writes about this as the concept of the anarch, as an individual who does not need authority over themselves, but in order to self-actualize, they do need to distinguish themselves from authority. So it's not that they need to follow authority, but that they need to rebel against authority. And if you remove authority totally from society collectively to the point where you're not able to interact with that, you're not able to oppose that, there's nothing to oppose anymore, then you get that kind of nihilism where the explorative function of science dissipates. And I think that's part of the reason why actually we're living in an age where maybe there are still some discoveries, but I was looking back at some historical analysis. I think Charles Murray did one, and there have been many others that actually try to examine from a material perspective, not a spiritual one, but quantitatively, how many important inventions were made per year over time. And what they find actually is that, from 1450, maybe as late as 1850, that was actually the peak of invention.
Yep.
It wasn't, it's not the computer age. It's not all of that is relatively. You're just you're compounding things quantitatively, and you're speeding up the process.
The computer age is the entire computer revolution is the electronicization of the Jacquard loom. It's the on-off switch is the basic invention. And Jacquard invented punch cards to run programmatic weaving programs on his loom so that he could duplicate patterns. And once you've got the idea of the on-off switch, that you just translate that to electricity, and you translate the doing that in a vacuum tube to doing that in a transistor. And it's the essential invention happens way back in the 18th century, and everything else is just working that out. So yeah, I find that analysis very persuasive. That there hasn't been a major breakthrough in anything but rocketry, I think, since about 1850, 1860.
Yeah, another way to think about it would just be in terms of logarithmic force in like explosive power. So, gunpowder and cannons come about in the 16th century, which is a huge leap because before that we had, you could put some oil on an arrow and fire an arrow or something. We had very little explosive capacity, and then it was just about taking that explosive capacity and first the idea was we'll put gunpowder in a steel chamber and it'll push a bullet out of the chamber. And then it was like, well, what if we generated steam and put it in a chamber and pressurize that, and then we could use that force. And so like the jump from gunpowder to steam is not as big from the jump from gunpowder to, fire arrows or whatever the equivalent would be. And then, going on from that now to the modern day, like rocketry, logarithmically speaking, not a huge, as big of a differential. So yeah, that, there is some kind of, there is a increasing disparity between the creativity and the ingenuity of technology, and on the other hand, the effects or the consequences as they are felt by the average person. The average person thinks back to 1800 or 1500 and thinks, well, a simpler time. It was a boring time. It was a time of stasis and conservatism and stagnation. But now everything's changing. Whereas from maybe a top-down view, it's actually the opposite. It's that those times were extremely dynamic, and the time we live in now is just people are sort of grinding to a halt, and this feeling of change is it's kind of a shrinking. The world is getting smaller because there's nothing to explore. I don't need to go to China. I can just go on Google Maps and I can go on the Street View and I can virtually walk down the street in China. So there's nothing to explore. And so the world shrunk, and that scientific desire to explore and to break boundaries, well, what's the point? All the boundaries have been broken. So the like the erotic desire that a person has to uncover the mysteries of the universe, what's the point? I can go on YouTube and look at the pale blue dot of the Earth in comparison with the sun, in comparison with the galaxy, in comparison with the universe, and just see that everything here is small and insignificant, and so why bother? Why bother trying? Why bother investigating it? If everything's reduced to a quantity, then it becomes meaningless. And that's why I think that science requires transgression of taboos, but in a relational sense. If there's like a perfect balance. And if you strike, and it's the same in music, you have point and counterpoint, right? You have different pitches which contrast to one another. In art, you have different colors, different shades, light and dark. They contrast each other. Once things become homogenized, once you reduce the contrast, you reduce the conflict, you reduce the tension, and you let go of the tension, then it's over. Then the song has ended. Then you've just got white noise.
You also inherently reduce creativity. So there's a difference between crossing boundaries and abolishing them. The homogenization abolishes them, whereas the explorer crosses them. If you, I don't know if you're old enough to remember the indie film revolution of the 90s. I was just young enough to catch the tail end of it and to join the fun.
I've got no recollection.
Okay, so Robert Rodriguez, who directed Sin City, started off his career doing a little film called El Mariachi, which he made for $7,000 after selling his body for scientific research. He did his production diary was called Rebel Without a Crew, and in it he details how much he came to appreciate working with such severe financial limitations. He said that he found that on later films, when he got a budget, having the ability to solve problems with money invariably led to an inferior, more homogenized product. Whereas when he had to think his way around obstacles, he came up invariably with something that was more serendipitous artistically. And I think that it's the homogenization of culture and also the homogenization of governmental structures and regulatory structures and whatnot has a flattening effect where you don't get sort of the evolutionary silos where people are forced to develop ideas and meaning and whatnot in a constrained environment. They can just sort of go out and buy their solution off the shelf, even ideologically speaking. It retards the development of culture, technology, science, and the individual spirit, I think.
Yeah, that's something I'm experiencing. I've decided to limit my income and do this Substack thing, and I think that there's a degree to which there's a feedback mechanism, a reward mechanism, between energy and money. You get more out of it in that sense. But yeah, there's also something where I don't know, maybe it's like a martyr complex of the more you sacrifice for something, or a sunk cost fallacy, the more you value what you're doing as opposed to working a job and you get a paycheck. Then you see the value in the paycheck rather than in the process of doing it. And it's interesting because a lot of, any problem that we have in society, like fertility, for example, if people aren't having enough kids, it's like, well, we'll throw money at them and then that will change the situation.
And it doesn't, except very, very locally and on very small scale. But yeah, I think meaning, this has been an obsession of mine, partly because I'm a novelist. And the art of writing a novel is creating the experience of meaning for the audience. But I also became a novelist partly because I'm obsessed with the question of how people make meaning. And I keep coming back to the idea that it's the connection to context that does it. So that's why, I'm in the process of, right now, I spent the day grooming a trail that I'm going to be using all winter. It's a fairly meaningless activity. I was raking brush out of the way and digging up rocks so that it's easier to run a snowblower over it and stuff like that. It's a fairly meaningless activity, but because doing it connects me to the site, connects me to the land, connects me to my future projects that are going to be done along that trail, it's an incredibly enjoyable and meaningful experience as opposed to just running a tractor over it and doing it all in 20 minutes. Because the process creates context, it becomes rewarding in itself.
That's interesting. In the time that we have today, I did want to address as well some of your writing, and you have an article entitled "The Myth of the 1950s." What is that myth, and what is the myth of the myth?
So the myth of the 1950s is that everybody looks back on the 50s as being a paradise because it was what you see on old 50s sitcoms, because the reality was the propaganda version that we've got left to us. It was white, it was middle class, no one had any conflict, there was no problems, everyone was prosperous, the future was bright. That's the myth of the 1950s. We all know, if we do any reading, that the reality on the ground was much more complicated, that there was a lot more racial tension, that there was a lot more class stratification, all that kind of stuff. And when you stop your analysis there, it's really easy to look at people who display nostalgia for that period as just being racist, sexist, homophobic, wanting a time that never was, looking for artificial simplicity. And especially looking for artificial simplicity, I think there's something kind of to that. But if you continue to drill down, what people are really remembering accurately is the sense of common identity across the classes, across the races, and the idea that they belonged to a nation. And that comes out of the fact that virtually 100% of the adult population of that era served in World War II, either on the battlefield or the home front. And that singular historical nexus created an American identity that had not existed before and has not existed since, because America's big enough that there's never really been that kind of common experience that unites everybody except that one time. And the boomer generation growing up in that era and then failing to find that kind of common identity when they became adults have spent a lot of the damage they caused, I think, is because they spent their lives feeling like they missed out on something, were cheated of something, and they've been flailing around trying to find it.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. I guess I wonder if that's linear or if it's cyclical, because I look back at even before America was founded, I think the Boston Revolt in the 17th century, at that time it was localized to the Puritans in Massachusetts. Mm-hmm. They certainly had a sense, or even before that, King Philip's War or something. Those events consolidated people and brought them together and gave them a sense of collective identity. After that, obviously, the Revolutionary War, and although it actually had, it was a small percentage of the population, it was 3%, and in fact, there was an equal amount of people who were sort of opposed to it. They just weren't as motivated, and they kind of just weren't very active, and the British were sort of disinterested and not super. I mean, when the war ended, it wasn't like. It wasn't ended actually on hateful terms in the way that, for example, World War II was ended, and there was still. I was watching this episode of The Twilight Zone actually that was banned for a number of years. This was during the Korean War, I think, or maybe it was Vietnam. But this episode dealt with a World War II veteran who was meeting a Japanese American played by George Takei, and he ends up killing him because the concept is that there's this blood feud between them. And there's other examples. I mean, even the Germans right after World War II, it wasn't as if, okay, well, we won the war, we'll shake hands, and you go your way and I'll go mine. So the Revolutionary War was relatively. It was decided in a relatively gentlemanly way. And after that, you, of course, had the Civil War, which in some senses united the North, and actually it united the South, but it didn't unite the country as a whole necessarily. So World War II, I guess, was, in terms of the 50 states of America, World War I, obviously, you could say, contributed as well in a different way, although I'm not as familiar.
But it was not a total war. World War II was the first total war the U.S. had since, even the Civil War wasn't quite a total war, but where the entire nation got deputized and pulled into the war effort. That's something that the U.S. has only ever seen the one time. Before that, of course, that was common in Europe because the countries are much smaller, the wars are much more frequent, and that sort of thing. But in terms of American consciousness, the World War II, and then they tried to recreate that with the Cold War with varying degrees of success. But with the Civil War, you had the core of the North pulled together and the core of the South pulled together, but there was the vast majority of the country was rural. They weren't involved. They would read about it in the newspaper. Or they'd hear about it from traveling preachers, but it wasn't something of existential concern to the average American, unless they were in or near the battlefield or had been drafted or that kind of thing.
Yeah, that's an interesting point because I guess there's a material angle and then there's also a mythological angle in that, people were rioting over the draft in the Civil War.
They didn't, New York. Yep.
Yeah, they didn't want to fight that war. Whereas World War II, even the biggest isolationists, the ones who thought the idea was terrible, they all snapped in line. I mean, there were very few people who went to jail over that. Most people were fully on board. And reading from the racial angle, there were I forget the names of the newspapers, but there were black-owned newspapers where their concept or the mythology of the war was that World War II was kind of a bargain or an exchange of blood for equality. That if African Americans were going to support the United States government, that this would be reciprocated and this was an opportunity to gain civil rights. Now, after that, the process wasn't really as smooth as it was projected to be.
Right. Well, I mean, that was the mythology, but the reality was that World War II was the first war that the bulk of the black contingent of the armed forces fought alongside the white soldiers as equals, at least in the enlisted ranks. And so there was a sense of common American identity built up that did fertilize the soil for the civil rights movement later on.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Even although you did have Japanese internment, there were also Japanese soldiers.
And German internment, too.
Right. There was, Italian. Actually, in Canada, they had an even, I believe they even had a harsher I mean, they basically interned anybody who wasn't French or English, I guess.
Or English, yep.
But yeah, I mean, even Japanese soldiers fought in the European theater. So it was definitely, I would say, also the fact that in World War I, both during and afterwards, it was a much more morally ambiguous conflict of, what exactly was being fought for, which side was good, which side was bad, why exactly are we going to war, what is the justification, and then, following the war, what was the retrospective? Was this, the war to end all wars? Was, it was much more ambiguous. You can see a lot of the seeds there, and some people say that World War I and World War II should be taken as one conflict together with a peace treaty in between. But, World War II, the retrospective on it is that it was the worst. It was a battle against the worst forces of evil of all time. And in that context, when you have, going back to kind of these original points about dialectic and dark and light, that in order to have that really positive effect on creating an American identity and bringing everybody together, you have to demonize some kind of enemy in order to bring forward that unity. And I actually, to take it really back far and to go into kind of the origins of religious thinking and psychology, this is sort of how I think about early Judaism, is that when you read the Torah, it's just constantly going on about how evil and how wicked all these idols are and all these gods. And you think, well, where does this come from, right? You had many different polytheistic religions, some of which were more tolerant, some were less tolerant, but there was a degree of syncretism or compatibility between different religious systems, and they were all sort of mixed together. But then you see this new monotheism which is so, and before that, Zoroastrianism as well, which took an existing field of culture and very fanatically opposed it. And my explanation for that is looking at World War II as a model for this kind of dynamic. If you really want to bring a population together as efficiently, as powerfully as possible, then you need to maximize the scapegoating of some sort of demon. You can't just look out at the world and say, oh, well, we're all kind of different and we all kind of get together. If you really want to bring together a disparate group of people, then you have to maximize demonization. And that's true for World War II in the 1950s. It's also true for ancient Iran and ancient Canaan, that if you wanted to bring together the 12 tribes, or you wanted to bring together the different tribes of Iran, which, Iran still today is very ethnically diverse, and I'm sure it was even more diverse at that point, to bring together those peoples to create a world religion or an imperial religion, which Zoroastrianism and ancient Judaism were. We don't think of Judaism as an imperial religion now because a lot of has changed.
It was the imperial religion that lost, right? The monotheistic project, which really begins in earnest under King Josiah, with the cleansing of the temple from all the other Jewish gods at the time, comes in the wake of the Babylonian conquest and the encounter with Zoroastrianism. You read bits of that in the book of Daniel and whatnot. The Jews are situated basically at the crossroads of the Levant, where you get Asia. They're right in between Asia Minor and the Persian Gulf and Egypt, which means that their entire history is armies marching across them from different directions. And coming out of the intelligentsia coming back from the Babylonian exile has been studying the monotheism or the dualism of the Babylonian religion and identifying, I think reasonably, if not correctly, that a strong, united imperial cult under a singular god is going to be much more culturally potent at allowing them to spread out and conquer on their own. And when they couldn't, what it did give them was a solid identity that's gone down through thousands of years.
Yeah. It's this. Once you're in power, once you're established as a culture, then it's much there's an incentive to kind of relax and let bygones be bygones and to be tolerant. And a lot of people think of Hinduism that way, right? Hinduism,
which it isn't.
yeah, you can do whatever you want. But when you go back and you read some of these religious texts, whether it's the Bhagavad Gita as part of the Mahabharata, or whether it's the Ramayana, and then you compare that to the Rig Veda, then to me, what I see is kind of the rise and fall of different imperial stages where, in fact, even before the Rig Veda, if you kind of reverse or retrogress this process backwards, I think there's a case to be made that the Rig Veda already is a syncretic religion between in a quote unquote, and I'm using the term indigenous in quotations because like the Dravidian language doesn't originate in India. So there's actually no such thing as a language that's native to India. All the languages of India come from other places. But there was an Upanishadic tradition. There was a Dravidian civilization. There was an Indus River Valley civilization. And they already had a religious system. They already had cults. They already had empires. And so when the Indo-European culture comes in, they introduce their gods. Now they've got a disagreement. They got a clash. They got to figure that out and mediate that together. And that's what the Rig Veda is. But if you compare the Rig Veda to Ramayana and then Mahabharata, you're seeing that there were multiple different, they call it an incarnation of God. Whenever they try to restart civilization, they say, well, God incarnated and he's got a new doctrine, he's got a new covenant, he's got a new agreement for us. And we have to kind of forget everything else that came before to an extent. And you actually see this in Norse paganism between the Aesir and the Vanir. So the story is that there were these two families.
Also, in Protestantism, with the development of the idea of dispensationalism, each of the dispensations is God making a new deal with humanity.
And Mormonism is kind of a logical extent, or I guess Mormonism is one of the few successful extensions of that. There have been other attempts that were less successful. Seventh-day Adventists, I think, have their own additions to make. But yeah, these variations on a theme. So looking at, as you said, there was an ancient Jewish polytheistic religion, the Elohim, plural, that then at some point there was a crisis point, or there was an opportunity to say, hey, we need to hit the reset button and do something different. And so we need to hyper-consolidate in this very black and white, we now use the term Manichaean, but that's referring to
another religion from Iran,
yeah, much later. But that term of making things digital rather than analog, making things very clear cut, simplifying the mythology, collapsing the mythology, and making it one dimensional. You're either good and you're with Yahweh, or you're evil and you're with the idols, and there's no ambiguity there. And when you can reduce that ambiguity, Nietzsche, I was reading recently, has this passage where he talks about how a mediocre person is kind of pulled in all sorts of different directions, and jack of all trades, and wants to do all sorts of different things, and says, well, maybe today I'll do this, maybe I'll do that, and then they end up kind of doing nothing, or a little bit of everything, and accomplishing nothing. Whereas a person who is single-mindedly devoted to a single thing, monomaniacal, this person, for good or for evil, is going to accomplish much more, even if they have the same amount of power or resources available to them. And so it's kind of like, this is how I would describe China today, is that China is a totalitarian state. The state has absolute control over every facet of every person's life. And so it's maximized its centralization onto a single point in Beijing, and the entire country, acts in lockstep. Whereas, countries in the West, countries like America, we want to get something done, and you got to jump through all these bureaucratic hoops, and you got to go through the Congress and the Senate and the presidency, and we vote every 4 years, and it flips and it flops and it goes back and forth. And so we're kind of in this minimalist position where we, like you're saying with World War II, we do not mobilize the available resources in our country. We kind of just let people do whatever they want and see how it shakes out, whereas the Chinese are very much mobilized. They are sort of in this wartime economy at all times. And that's one of the reasons why I'm skeptical of the potential of China to continue this exponential growth versus America.
Well, you're right to be skeptical. The exponential growth actually stopped 10 years ago. They've been revising their numbers, both their population numbers, their economic numbers. They are already way on the downslope of implosion. America's always been this really weird hybrid, because you have there's always been really two versions of America. There's the version that the hoi polloi believes in, which is that it's a land of freedom and opportunity, and you can do what you want, and you've got a chance, but not a guarantee that you could do something great. And then there's been the imperial project, and this has been the case since the beginning, is one of the reasons that the Constitutional Convention shook out like it did, throwing out the Federalist Papers, bringing in the Constitution, and then having to compromise on that imperial vision by with the Bill of Rights, which the states were demanding in order to, as price of ratification. The Hamiltonian school, backed by the idealism of Jefferson, saw the United States' project as civilizing the world. You talked about this recently in a note on Substack, or in one of your essays, talking about how the left wing has always been an imperialist project. And the idea being that you bring the bring the consciousness of liberty to the world, free all the people, maximize equality and human dignity and that sort of thing, by force majeure. And the history of American cultural warfare is between that vision, which comes from the WASPs and ultimately the Puritans, which has had a lot of, which has brought along a lot of sympathetic hangers-on from the European, from the continental philosophical tradition, the Marxists, the socialists, the social democrats, that kind of thing, the critical theorists, and then the much more anarchic spirit that you find concentrated in the early years, especially in Appalachia and then later on in the Southwest, where you have the individualists that, free from the pressures of centralization, have been able to build incredible empires. And it's been the dynamic tension between these two that's kept America able to reinvent itself over the years. And then flitting between those two camps on a culture war level, you've got the cultural conservatives, who are sometimes with the left, who are sometimes with the individualists, which is why I don't think, in European continental terms, I don't think it's accurate to conceive of America as having a right wing. It's certainly got parties that identify with that, but the kind of nationalism that it takes to be a European right-winger just has never really existed in America. There's been the isolationists and the imperialists, but nationalism in the U.S., compared with nationalism on the continent, is much more of a squishy ideal than it is a real thing.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's kind of what people mean when they say, like, America is a young country and we haven't really developed. That's also something that according to Plato, the Egyptians said of the Greeks, that they were like a young country and they had no memory of themselves. I would also say that to an extent about Russia, that people think of Russia as this kind of ancient, primordial, old world territory, which maybe it is in certain religious or ideological ways, but in terms of geography, it's not far behind America in its development.
Yeah, before Catherine the Great there and Ivan the Terrible, there's just not a lot there. Yeah, my Russian history is way worse than my European or American history, but if my understanding is correct, the Russian project has always been a matter of trying desperately to secure the borders in a way that will keep the Europeans and the Turks out, so that the Rus people, the core ethnicity of Russia, can survive. Because it was, in the early days, it was the Ottomans raiding north for slaves. That's where we get the word slaves, is from the Slavs, that were originally the most popular slave stock in the Ottoman Empire. And then later it was the Germans and the Poles and the Czechs raiding north into the northern European plain and trying to get a hold of Moscow for reasons of controlling the agricultural land and the mineral resources that were at the western edge of what's today Russian territory. And then since the late 19th century, with the formulation of the world island theory of geopolitics, you see the shape of the world as we understand it now really solidify. The idea being that any power that could control both Berlin and Moscow and the land in between would have enough seaports, enough industrial might, enough population, and enough mineral resources to effectively rule the Eastern Hemisphere. And so American foreign policy since the late 19th century has been more or less obsessed with keeping those two powers separate.
Yeah, the etymology of slave is interesting because I know in the Slavic languages, slava means glory, and most of the Sorbs, Serbs, that ethnonym means like, people or word, but it is possible that that ultimately the Greek term I know in German it's sklave. There might be that might ultimately be where it comes from is the Byzantines. There's also a possibility of skula, meaning war booty, but they're both from the Greeks and the Byzantines. The relationship between the Ottomans and Byzantines is interesting. I've been trying to kind of unfold the history of slavery in that region, and try to figure out, what was the effect of Christianization, because definitely the pagans had no problem at all with slavery. But with the introduction of Christianity, there was
depends on the pagan tribes that you're talking about. Slavery was common to all cultures up until the Christians really started, certain segments of the Christians really started trying to get rid of it. But it was always far less common in Northern Europe than it was around the Mediterranean and the Levant and in other warmer climates, partly because the utility of a slave in the northern climates is just a lot lower. They're expensive to keep and feed. They don't bring as much value as a farmhand in the north as having another warrior, having another hunter does. So it was always much less common to keep slaves in the north, and that's one of the reasons that it's the English and the Dutch where you first see the ideas underlying liberalism emerging into practical politics, because there just wasn't the tradition of the scattered freeholders in the small villages that weren't very into slavery, that weren't possible to centralize, created a deep culture of local community and the rights of the individual, which you didn't have surviving nearly as long in the big agricultural areas in the Near East.
Yeah, definitely agriculture. I mean, my theory of agriculture is that agriculture is a product of slavery. Is that you can't begin doing agriculture unless you first domesticated animals and domesticated human beings and making them into slaves, because nobody wants to work in a field and eat bread. Today people romanticize that, but at the time that had a lot of bad health effects, and it was motivated, I think, by fire and brimstone style preaching, basically, and probably human sacrifices as well. So there's a lot to talk about there, and you're correct to say that hunter-gatherer societies, which agriculture was introduced to Northern Europe, but I think actually at some point people kind of gave up on it and got most of their calories from fishing. Similar to Japan, kind of a similar situation.
Well, particularly they didn't do much. The grain agriculture, if my history is correct, the grain agriculture in Northern Europe was largely barley and durum wheat and stuff that requires almost no labor. The stuff grows in marginal soil. It grows fairly wild. It doesn't require being tended much, whereas the grains that you grow further south they're much more water intensive. They require much more care. My understanding of how the bureaucratic state bootstraps is you start off with small scale agriculture in Iraq and Egypt, and very quickly you have to negotiate water rights because the fertility of the soil is greater than the availability of the water. And so you get the development of irrigation and water rights, and the people managing the water rights then very naturally have the in to take over effective ownership of all the agriculture.
Yeah, this has been a very interesting and wide-ranging discussion. There's much more that I could ask you. You've written much more.
I'm happy to stick around. I didn't know how long you wanted to go, so I blocked off the whole afternoon. So.
Oh, I appreciate that. I've had. I try to schedule a lot of these not simultaneously, but on the same day. So if one person cancels, there's another person there. But I have an hour blocked off for today, so I do have to get going soon. But I do want to give you last word, concluding remarks, and let me know what you're working on, what you're reading, what you think people should be reading and checking out. Give the listeners something to chew on for next time.
Oh boy. Well, I write fiction. I blog regularly at jdanielsawyer.substack.com. I also write fiction. You can find all my fiction and loads of podcasts at jdsawyer.net. I've got a really busy publishing year coming up starting beginning of next year, actually. I'm releasing 3 new novels and 2 nonfiction books, one of which is called Reclaiming Your Mind, an Autodidact's Bible. It's everything I've learned about how to teach yourself anything. And the other is called The Art of Agency, which is about the struggle for maintaining individuality and making meaning in a managerial system that's designed to homogenize, and as a result also winds up stripping individual meaning and agency from life.
Very good. People will definitely have to check that out. And this was great. I have a lot of these scheduled for going into January now, so I can't say I'll necessarily speak to you soon, but I hope we are able eventually to wrap around and have another discussion.
I'd love to.
Yeah, absolutely. But this was great, and we'll definitely speak again. Until then, Dan, I really appreciate your time.
All right, have a good one.
You too. Bye-bye. All right, we are out of here. Guys, I appreciate you watching. I appreciate you listening. It's a lot of hard work putting these together. I'm not good with technical stuff. I'm not good with computers. And so it's really difficult for me to do, but I think it's valuable. I think the discussions are worth it. So if you feel the same way, definitely show me some love. Show Dan some love. Go check out his stuff. Like it, comment, restack, all that good stuff. Until next time, guys. See you then. Bye-bye.